Thank you very much for a kind welcome. I'll be held firmly to account now because my ex-Bible studies teacher is sitting in your front row, Keith Tupper.
Hey.
So how are you, Keith? I haven't seen you for a while. Okay. Now, am I audible now?
Yep.
Great. Okay. And yes, last time I was here it was a discussion about Parliament House, Canberra, and the dramas there, or the dramas stroke melodramas keep on unfolding there. And I guess we'll wait and see what happens probably early next year now for a new federal election. The talk today will be about John Monash. By, I suppose, happenstance, we're talking one day after Armistice Day, and in fact a very significant Armistice Day because in November the 11th, 1934, our Shrine of Remembrance opened, and it was a big deal on the day. Did anybody see any of the footage on the TV yesterday about it? Yeah, don't worry if you didn't, not a big deal. But in just getting ready for today, I did a bit of research because I knew it was 90 years ago that the shrine had finally opened, and I found this photo. Now, I'm not going to use any of that. I'll be handing around these various photos, but this one is a good opening stanza. It was the shrine on November the 11th, 1934, and there were a modest 300,000 people there. So it's a very big deal, and I'll just start handing these around. Just once you've all seen it, just drop them on a table at the back, and I'll collect them then. So the subject today is John Monash, who was by far our most famous military guy. And I will touch on briefly on his military achievements, but the bigger deal for me is his achievements as an engineer, especially around Victoria, and his complicated personal life. Be in no doubt this was really complicated. But here's a nice photograph of John, just to set a bit of a scene, a portrait that was done just at the peak of his powers. He would have been around 55 years old then. He didn't live a long life, he lived to age 66, so that's 11 years before he died. In terms of my knowledge about John Monash, I guess I'll group it in three. Firstly, I had a grandfather, I had two grandfathers, but the one I spent a lot of time with was Walter Atkins from Brunswick, and he'd been a Vickers gunner serving under John Monash on the Western Front. So while I was helping Walter repair cricket bats, he would tell me bits and pieces about his time at Villas, at Wipers, at Plug Street, which are all names of battlefields around the Western Front. That was my first encounter with John Monash, and I might say Walter was very grateful because, as he said, if the war had gone on beyond November 1918, he would have been dead and I would not have been alive. No. It was as blunt as that he could just see his mates being killed every battle, yet another one of his mates dying, and he had no expectation about living into 1919. So that was encounter one with John Monash. The second encounter was that I went to McLeod High School and then to Melbourne University Engineering School, and the engineering faculty were absolutely thrilled that Victoria's second university had been named after one of their graduates, John Monash, who graduated in the 1890s. My third encounter with John Monash was 25 years later, or thereabouts, out riding. I was living in Mont Albert. A group of us were riding around the Outer Circle railway line. People know what I'm talking about there? Yeah. Mostly it's become a charming place for bike riding through the eastern suburbs, underpasses, overpasses. And one of our number on that bike ride was a history teacher, and we stopped for coffee, and he talked about his understanding about John Monash. The young John Monash, he said, had been the engineer in charge of the Outer Circle Railway, and he'd built it in very well over about 5 years. Yeah. And in addition, this is where it got interesting, he said, of course, this project was where John had his first great romance, and that was with Annie Gabriel. And we all said, who's Annie? And it turns out Annie was his age. Is that echoing too much for you?
No, it's okay.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so John had this raging affair with Annie Gabriel, which was grossly, there were big objections, not from John or Annie, they were in love with each other, but John's two sisters objected because she was Gentile and he was Jewish. That was one problem. And the bigger problem was probably Fred, the work supervisor, a big guy, who objected mightily to his wife having an affair with anybody, and it finally terminated in a punch-up at South Yarra Station, where John came off the worst, and Fred and Annie departed for Sydney. And you might think that would be the end of it, but in fact, there's lots of letters over the next 40 years, clear evidence that John and Annie stayed very good friends for a long, long time after that brief encounter, brief altercation at South Yarra Station. So that were my introductions to the life and times of this interesting character called John Monash. The other thing that history teacher, the other point he made was that Monash was a really interesting case study in all of the challenges in being a European immigrant to Australia in the 1800s. Not to Australia, to the Victorian colony. We weren't even a country then. So it was a big challenge for him being a European immigrant from an area of Europe called Prussia, which is now part of Western Poland, and also of being Jewish and all of the anti-Semitism. So again, my interest kicked off from there. In terms of me learning a lot more, there's three really good books. I'm not going to bore you and ask you to read them or test you out, but a really good read is a thing by Roland Perry, which deals with his civilian life and with his time during World War I. And that was published maybe 15, 20 years ago. A much more recent thing by a journalist, Grantley Keyser, is also a good read, a bit slimmer. And the reason I'd say it's worth reading is that there's a lot more from Monash's personal diaries and his personal relationships. The other one's more about the war and so on. But this one, you get a lot about Monash's personal interactions. So they're both a good read, and they're both still on sale in a good bookshop near where you live, I guess. So, yeah. Now, I suppose before we go further with Monash, just to say, in summary, what you get out of these books is there's 5 things about John Monash. Firstly, he was somebody with immense talent. He was immense talent, and he overcame a lot of social disadvantage. That's number one. Number two, he was a workaholic, and he worked basically through until the day before he died. He was lying there on death's bed in 1931, and he was still convening meetings around his bed and issuing orders and writing minutes up until 24 hours before he died. Thirdly, he did make this huge contribution to our infrastructure, not just the electricity system, but a lot of other things as well. Fourthly, he was a shameless self-promoter. He was very, very effective at getting his name in the paper on a regular basis, and that did contribute to his success. He had a very clever technique for that during the war, which I'll come back to. And fifthly, he did have this complicated personal life. So I'll try and run through a lot of that in the next 15 to 20 minutes. Young John is a photo of him as a teenager. But his mum and dad were Prussian Jews. They'd emigrated to the colony of Victoria in 1860, and the dad ran importing businesses and shops in Melbourne. And in 1865, John was born. He was the eldest of 3 kids. So 1865, he came into the world, and in the late 1860s, Victoria actually had a bit of a mini recession, the dad's business went bust and he had to do something else. So the family decamped from Melbourne and went to live in Jerilderie in southern New South Wales. People know where Jerilderie is. If you're driving up to Queensland, you go through it. So John's early schooling was in Jerilderie, where the dad ran a shop. And he was a brilliant scholar at this school, and it was a single teacher school, and the teacher was in awe that this kid could play music, had 3 languages, could do maths, and an excellent writer as well. So that was that side. Monash had a good time, not least because, as he said, he met Ned Kelly. And for a little kid to meet a bushranger was quite a big deal. So that was Jerilderie. Because he'd been so good at school there, the teacher recommended to his mum and dad they look around for scholarships. And young John got a scholarship to go to Scotch College here in Melbourne. Now in that era, the early 1870s, Scotch was actually based in East Melbourne, not over in Hawthorn where it is now. John went there, and again he did really well going through the high school years at Scotch College. And again, there was much, there was great. People were very impressed at how effective he was. That allowed him to sit for his matric exams early. So at age 16, he had an entry to a university, and the only one in Melbourne was the new Melbourne University. He enrolled in arts and engineering, and off he went to Melbourne Uni. And I must say, a lot of what we know about Monash is because he wrote, from age 13 onwards, he wrote diaries. And they weren't just, went to school. There was lots of detail about what he was thinking at the time, whether he had a good drink last night, whether he'd met some girl last night. So we do have a lot of information from when he was 13 onwards. And coming out of those early teenage diaries, there were 3 things I'll quote to you. Number 1, he sincerely wanted to become, quote, famous and admired. So there was an ambition there for this young guy. He wanted to be recognised. The second was there's numerous examples of flirtatious affairs with both Jewish girls and Gentile girls. He wasn't a lone ranger. There was lots of different girls there. And the third bit probably contributed to his early-ish death. There was a lot of writing about smoking and drinking. So that was all in his teenage diaries. In 1884, another big thing happened. He was at uni, but he took this quite momentous decision to join a thing called the Melbourne University Company of the Victorian Rifles. Now, the Victorian Rifles was like a reserve Victorian regiment of the British Army. So here we were still a colony, but they'd formed this, the state of Victoria had formed this reserve company, and Melbourne University had a platoon, if you like, in that. Now, from Monash's viewpoint, he probably joined it partly out of patriotism because of the great fear in the 1880s about Russia, and whether we'd be invaded or bombarded by this other empire, Russia. But it'd be fair to say the other reason he joined, of course, was for a young Jewish boy, this was a good way into Victorian society through the Army Reserve. So he joined in 1884 and hold this, just remember, he then stayed in reserve as a reserve soldier right through to 1914 when he became a regular. So this wasn't a 2-year affair or anything with the Army, this was the next 30 years. He was there initially as a non-commissioned officer, progressed up to officer rank and so on, all over that 30 years. Okay, in 1885, he's studying at Melbourne, but the family business was going bad again, and he felt the need to get a job just to support the whole family. So he threw his hat into the ring to become an assistant engineer on Prince's Bridge. Now, a bit of history there. I hadn't realised that Prince's Bridge, as an extension of Swanston Street, but the first version was built in 1850. It was a narrow gutted thing. By the 1880s, they decided to build a big, wide bridge. So John became an assistant engineer on that job, worked there in between university studies and excelled. He did very well. So 3 years later, the economy of Victoria was still going well in the late 1880s. A promoter decided to build an outer circle railway. And he looked around for a talented guy to be the engineer on that. So amazingly, he picked this 23-year-old John Monash to be the engineer on the outer circle. Monash still did not have his degree. He was still studying, but he clearly had huge energy. And so off he went, still doing his part-time studies, but he became the engineer on this outer circle. And just to anchor you firmly, it started in Fairfield, down across what became the Channel Highway Bridge when it fell in the heat, out through Kew and Canterbury, down the line of the Alamein train line, and finally joined the Dandenong line down around Oakley. And that was to be built by this team, where Monash was the engineer and Fred Gabriel was the work supervisor. The head office, if you like, for the project was in Hartwell, and if you think about Toorak Road, heading out with the tram in it, and there's a railway overbridge in this little suburb of Hartwell. That's where the project office was. It was actually a suburban house. John, as the engineer, occupied the front rooms. The back rooms were occupied by Fred and Annie. That's where they lived. And each day Fred would come out foolishly to supervise the teams, digging works, fields, bridges and all that, while John was doing all the comps, and in between his relationship with Annie blossomed big time. And he was absolutely besotted, but in the end, after a couple of years, it ended with this biffer armour at South Yarra Station. But it does add colour and movement to this otherwise very dour engineer to realise that he had this huge affair. Just finishing off on that project, it was finally commissioned in 1892, but by 1892 Victoria was in a depression, almost as bad as the Great Depression in 1928. It was awful. And so this project, this commercial project of having a railway line fell in heat. And it only ran for about 5 years, and then it all shut up. And it was recreated as a goods line from Fairfield down to this paper mill run by APM. And then the other bit that was re-established was the Alamein train line as a suburban line. But yeah, it was successfully built by John, but it did fall in the heat commercially. While that was all happening, and after Annie had departed for Sydney, John's sisters did find him a suitable Jewish girl to marry. She was Victoria Moss, from a very affluent family, and they married in 1891, and they had a child a bit later. Her name was Bertha, named after John's very talented mother, who died a few years before. The relationship between Vic and John was stormy, to say the least. And 4 reasons for that. And this is me as an engineer, I can speak of this with great authority. Vic had zero interest in his work. Now I can tell you, it goes down very badly for a young engineer proud of his work on Princess Bridge and outer circles to have a wife who had no interest. Secondly, it was a depression. Times were very tough. There was no money around, and John certainly didn't have much, but Vic just kept on spending. She expected to have servants and all sorts of things, and he had almost no money. And the other reality was that there were a lot of other women around Melbourne with a lot of interest in John. And one of them, you've got to hold this name in your mind, Lizzie Bentwich. Now, Lizzie had been a friend of Victoria's, but Lizzie was also besotted by John, and there was obviously some affair happening there, which only really, or chapter 1 of it only terminated in 1898 when she headed off back to London. Okay, so she left in 1898, and I suppose Victoria thought, phew, got rid of that one. In terms of John, he did get his engineering degree in 1893. Had a lot of trouble earning money as an engineer, but he was very good on his feet. So he made enough money through the rest of this awful depression as an expert witness in courts, dealing with various bridges and some that had fallen down, or commercial deals that had fallen over, and also as an arbitrator, because he really was very good at talking to people and commanding facts. So they survived through the 1890s on his money earning from those sort of things until the economy recovered basically around 1900. And at that stage, Australia, well, not just Victoria, Australia's prosperity resumed, and life got a lot better for the Monashes and for most of the rest of our forebears who were here. And it'd be fair to say, actually, what I neglected to do is photo of Annie, good looking, a photo of John and Victoria. I didn't mean to pass those around. About the time of the economy was recovering, Monash did a clever thing. He got the Australian rights to a process of manufacturing reinforced concrete using what's called the Monia process. Now, dumb Alan, I thought Monia was named after John Monash. Wrong. Monia was a Frenchman who worked out how to build steel reinforcing into concrete. So by chance, this young John Monash here grabbed the rights to this technology and prospered greatly by building lots of things around Australia and around Victoria. One of the nicest things that he did using this technology is the Morell Bridge. Now, anybody remember where the Botanic Gardens are? Yeah. And a bridge nearby, a narrowish bridge, beautifully built, called the Morell Bridge, or sometimes it's called the Anderson Street Bridge. Yeah. So that was one of their early works, but there was lots of other ones as well. So 1900 on for the next 13 years, Monash and Vic prospered. The business was going well, money was rolling in. They bought a Toorak mansion called Iona and a newfangled French car. It wasn't a Renault, I can't think what brand it was. John became very active in Melbourne's learned societies and charities. They had a grand overseas tour in the late about 1908 through the UK, USA and Germany. And of course John, he understood German, so he was able to better understand the way Germany was expanding and getting more aggressive and was willing to take on France and the United Kingdom and try and be a world power. So he was very worried. In parallel with all of that, he put on a lot of weight. So he went from being a slim young guy to a guy, this one, he was about 40, about 48, I guess. But here he was, he looks a lot paunchier. And I guess that's just a function of prosperity at that time, that you put on weight and you look prosperous and all of that. But at the same time, as he was doing all that, he was still busy in the Army Reserve. It had moved from being a British Army Reserve to being Australian Army. He was still active. I think they called it the North Melbourne Rifles, that he was part of. And because he was a businessman, he understood how power worked. And each time a British general would come out, he would befriend that general. So before the war, he'd met and befriended Lord Kitchener, who was the chief of all Britain's armies and navies, and he'd also befriended a guy called Ian Hamilton, and we've all heard his name. He was the failed general at Gallipoli. He was the guy who didn't quite deliver Gallipoli, but nevertheless, it was a reality that Monash, go-getter and forceful, confident, had actually befriended them as people before World War I. 1914. The war broke out. It'd be fair to say Monash was 49 years old and prosperous. He didn't have to go to war, but he did. He flipped over from being a reservist he put his hand up and he stepped out of his private life with his companies, and he actually took a commission in the full-time army. And I won't go through all of the detail of that, but it'd be fair to say over the next 5 years he was initially our chief censor for a few months, and that was partly because he spoke German. Then he became the commander of the second convoy. This is the second AIF convoy taking our troops across to Egypt and the Middle East. Then he was a mid-level brigadier general at Gallipoli. He wasn't always on the front line, but he was there, and there was death and mayhem around, and he was seen to acquit himself well, not brilliantly, but well. Then when Gallipoli was evacuated, he had his 3 years on the Western Front, and that's where his organising skills became more and more clear, not just to the Australian Army, but to the British Army and the British government. And so he kept on getting ratcheted up from being a brigadier general to a major general to being a lieutenant general. And when he was at lieutenant general level, he was then in charge of all of Australia's armed forces on the Western Front. This was, be fair to say, this was with much opposition from our Prime Minister of the day, who was Billy Hughes. Billy Hughes hated having anybody who had more profile than him. Oh yeah, so there was no love lost between John Monash and Billy Hughes. The three big battles that Monash triumphed were all in 1918. From what I can check of my grandfather's time, he was involved in 3 of them at Hamel, which is about July, and then Amiens or Villers-Bretonneux in August, and then Mont-Saint-Quentin in August. And I've certainly got some verbal feedback from my grandfather all those years ago, but each time you read the history books, they were a triumph because Monash and his equivalent from Canada began to understand how you integrate tanks into tackling trench warfare. And be fair to say, they worked out a way where you have bombardment from artillery, then you have the tanks go out in the lead, and the infantry come in behind, essentially hide behind the tanks as the tanks are making their progress across the landscape. And that meant, instead of having battles where you might regard as a tremendous win to advance 100 metres, on August the 8th, at the Battle of Amiens, they advanced 5 kilometres in one day. And that was my grandfather telling me that, but that's what the history books say as well. This was all about having the tanks in the lead, and the tanks would they'd do a relay race, essentially, where some tanks would go ahead, then they'd have to stop and refuel, others would go ahead, and the young soldier boys with their machine guns and so on would come in behind and made enormous progress leading to the rapid end of the war in 1918. Monash, through that time, was immensely successful with his troops. He was also got pretty good press coverage here, although it was very uneven. Our official biographer of the war, or official historian, was Charles Bean, and he had no time for this pushy Jew. So his reports back here were bad. Also, be fair to say, a fellow called Keith Murdoch, Rupert's dad, didn't have much time for Monash because he wanted another Australian general to be the lead, a fellow called Brudenell White, who may have been a good general, I don't know. But at least Keith Murdoch wasn't anti-Semitic, whereas Bean was. Against that, John, a bit of enterprise here. What you do is you're just behind the battlefield, you've got a secretary to type stuff up. So you type up these scripts, and they're all neatly done. And the script would read the wise and prudent leadership of Lieutenant General John Monash and the gallant performance of his troops led to a huge triumph here or there or there. They'd then go in envelopes and be sent home on express ships. They'd land in Victoria's letterbox in Iona, and she enjoyed going in to see various newspaper editors. And she got on well with all Melbourne. Melbourne was the capital of the country at that stage, So she knew the editor of the Age, the Argus, the Herald, the Sun. She'd take their scripts in. And these editors loved having success. So the overall press coverage of John Monash in the and there was no radio, it was all about print media, that more than outweighed the negative from Charles Bean. People read with huge pride that their young soldier boys, Anne or Hamel, had triumphed. And this was all courtesy of this clever way of getting around the censors and overcoming the anti-stuff out of Charles Bean. Also worth saying that during his time on the Western Front, which is not that far away from London, he'd get leave, not often, but each time he'd go across to London for a week's leave, who was waiting for him in London but Lizzie Bentwich. So this affair out of the 1890s rekindled, and they were highly visible all around London. There was no question about is Sir John married? Is there a wife somewhere? It was just John. It was General Monash and his partner, Miss Bentwich, met the Queen or met the King. You know, and Monash got on well with George V. But that was the scene in London. While back here, Victoria was doing his bidding, feeding the newspaper editors with the scripts. 1918, November the 11th, armistice was declared, and of course thereafter all the troops began the process of wanting to come home. Billy Hughes didn't want Monash to come home because he was worried about Monash being too popular and taking over his job. So he gave Monash another job, which is, you've been successful on the battlefield, now I want you, John Monash, to organise the repatriation of our troops, which Monash did. It was a tough thing to do because by then the Spanish flu was around, and organising troop ships and trying to find ways of getting these young guys home. And some of the stories are not great. One of my other grandfather, he was certainly stuck in Port Phillip Bay for about 6 to 8 weeks because his ship had Spanish flu. And so they were in Port Phillip Bay. They could see Port Melbourne, but they weren't allowed to come ashore until the Spanish flu had worked its evil punishment on these young guys. And a lot of them did die at sea. It'd be fair to say the way the officers on those ships maintained order was simply to ply all of the troops with beer. And that left that grandfather of mine with a serious alcohol problem for the rest of his life. But at least he did come back ashore. In parallel with that, in parallel with all of that, John's wife, Vic, and his daughter, Bertha, did go over to London. They did meet John, and just by chance, her long-time friend, Lizzie, was there as well. That was amazing, wasn't it? But Vic and Bertha were able to share with some of the joy of early 1919, and then they all, John, Vic and Bertha, all came back to a hero's welcome in late 1919. Interestingly, they came on ship, of course. The ship came into Port Phillip Bay, and they then disembarked on a launch and came off at St Kilda Pier, rather than Station Pier. Came off at St Kilda Pier. And then there was a hero's drive up to Government House, where the governor of the day, and that was the Governor General, because we were the national capital then. The Governor General welcomed Sir John back, and then Monash and his family went back to live in Iona, and he started to resume a civilian life. Now that civilian life, he had hopes it would involve something at the federal government level, but it never did. Billy Hughes was never ever going to offer John Monash anything, but offsetting that, the Victorian government did. They promptly offered him the chairmanship of this new thing called the State Electricity Commission with a handsome salary, and he said for the next 10 years that was his main mission in life, was to give Victoria reliable power, and that involved a new brown coal open cut down at Yvonne, a power station alongside it, transmission lines back to Melbourne, transmission lines all around the rest of Victoria to provide reliable power. And that was his principal preoccupation for the next 10 years. In parallel, the Victorian government also gave him another gig, and that was to be the Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne University. So through the 20s, he was both VC of Melbourne University and the chair of the SEC. But during that time, early in that time, Vic did die. She'd had a long-run cancer, they couldn't cure it, and she died in 1922, I think it was. And amazingly, about 3 months later, Lizzie re-arrived in Victoria on a ship. Now, it would appear that John thought Lizzie could come and live with them at Iona in Toorak. But daughter Bertha was having none of that. So from there on, for the rest of the 20s, John's life revolved around living at Iona, going to work each day, working really hard, but during the day he'd meet Lizzie, who he was paying to put up at various high-end hotels around Melbourne, and he had a social life with Lizzie, who progressively became Elizabeth, by the way. She stopped being Lizzie, or Lizette, she was Elizabeth, and they had this quite good social life. The races, concerts and all of that, and restaurant meals, while at home he was a good father to Bertha, and he progressively acquired 3 grandchildren. And so he was a very proud grandfather as well. But this was in parallel with this other life with Lizzie in and around the CBD. We're just about at the end of the story now, but also through the 20s, he actually had 3 other really important things he did for Australia. The first was for Victoria, and that was in 1923. There was a police strike, and all the coppers worked. They was paid as good, and they all walked off the job. And there was a great fear about criminality, violence, and all that. The Premier asked Sir John to recall some of his soldiers, both officers and sergeant majors and sergeants, and so for about 72 hours, Victoria's policing was provided by General Monash and his and these officers and so on, and that did save a lot of violence and did save a lot of thievery. The second was about this Yallourn power station was going to use brown coal, and the only country in the world that knew about that was Germany. And there was a lot of resistance from a lot of people there, inviting Germans, who just fought this world war against. But Monash used his prestige to insist that a limited number of the German engineers be allowed to come to Victoria because they had the skill. The third thing was the big battle about whether or not to have a shrine. There were 2 camps. The pro-shrine camp was led by Sir John Monash. The anti was led by Sir Keith Murdoch. Murdoch's view, and I'm not saying there was anything right or wrong, I could see both arguments. The Murdoch view was there is money that ought to be spent on these damaged returned soldiers. A lot of them are very, very damaged, and I can see that amongst my 2 grandfathers. So Murdoch's view was all that money should be spent on the welfare of these very damaged young men. Against that, the Monash view, and it is the one that finally prevailed, was we need to remember what happened, and for that we need a substantial monument where we can each year we can recognise the sacrifice. And in the end, that view prevailed. So by the latter part of the 20s, it was agreed there would be a shrine, and that was finally built and opened in 1934 after Monash had died. Monash, he was still going strong through 1930, but by 31, he was 66 years old, heart problems, probably driven by smoking and too much eating, and almost certainly also driven a bit by the battlefield life, because even though generals are not in harm's way, he was working enormous hours, 7 days without sleep, that sort of thing, through the various battles. So he kept on working from his hospital. Well, it wasn't a hospital bed, he died at home, he was cared for at home. And until the day before he died, he was still convening meetings and all of that, but he finally died. He finally died in October 31, age 66, And there's great sadness from all these young soldier boys, very well recognising that if the war had carried on, they would be dead. So they were very grateful. The funeral revolved around a service in a Melbourne synagogue, and then a funeral procession down St Kilda Road. One of my uncles, Wal Atkins Jr., was 8 at the time, and he could easily remember being part of the whole thing. He said there were enormous crowds as Monash's coffin was wheeled past. And then Monash was finally interred down at Brighton Cemetery alongside his wife Vic. And if you ever want to go down to Brighton Cemetery, it's a nice cemetery. It's on unlike the Heidelberg one on a steep hill, the Brighton one's on a gentle, got it mostly flat, but with a gentle slope on the east side, and there up on that gentle rise is the graves of John and Vic. And they're clearly marked, it's not hard to find them. So that was the end of his life. In terms of his legacy, obviously the unexpected early end of World War I, because nobody on the Allied side believed it would happen in 1918. They thought it was going to go right into 1919 once the Americans come over in full force, but it ended early. So that meant people like me are grateful, and a lot of others are grateful because our grandpas were alive. And in my case, yes, my grandfather came back. They both came back. My dad was born in 1921, my mum in 1922. Now, neither of those would have happened, and I dare say there'll be people here with a similar story. So there's that gratitude. There's all the infrastructure around Victoria that we can be grateful for, not just the electricity infrastructure, roads and bridges and so on. There's all the things named after Monash. Monash University, Monash Medical Centre, Monash Freeway, I could go on. The Monash name didn't really continue, not directly, because he only had one child, that was Bertha, and she married Gordon Bennett. So the name you might encounter, and I've met one of these people, there's a number of the offspring, the next generation down, who proudly travel under the name of whatever their Christian name is or the Jewish name is, Monash Bennett. And they're still around Melbourne. There's quite a few of them who are Monash Bennetts, and they will be the offspring, either grandchildren, great-grandchildren, or whatever from John Monash. The other little legacy that he left was that the tactics that Monash and Arthur Curry from Canada adopted, using the tanks as the spearhead for the infantry, were studied with great interest by an entity called the Wehrmacht, the German Wehrmacht, in the 1930s, and became the template for how they ran their blitzkrieg at the beginning of 1939. Be also fair to say there was another American general who also studied them with great interest, and his name, of course, was George Patton. And Patton used the same tactics with the American invasion of Sicily, and then Italy, and then the Normandy invasion. Patton's tactics were very similar to the blitzkrieg and all modelled on the Monash system. Okay, that's what I'm going to end my talk. Happy to answer any questions. There's one or two others. Just before I felt any questions, another couple of photos. Just hand them around. There's an imperfect photo of the original Yallourn power station, now being demolished. Here's John and family with Lizette on one side. there's John and Lizette in the 20s, and here's John Monash probably within a matter of a few months of him dying as Vice Chancellor of Melbourne University. Okay, just waiting too long.
Oh, terrific.
Fantastic. Take questions.
Yeah.
The RSL, that was initiated by John Monash too, was it not?
I think it wasn't just Monash. There were a lot of other people could see the benefit of that. They used his name often because he had so much credibility, but it'd be fair to say that was not opposed by people like like Keith Murdoch or whatever. So a lot of people wanted something like that, and it's flourished ever since. Yeah.
Helen, you mentioned his name. Now I understand he dropped the C from his name at some point to get away from the German connotation.
Yeah.
When did he do that?
It's a good question. So far as the books say, it actually happened about 1863, before he was born. The mum and dad were very keen to move out of being seen as Prussian Jews, so they actually appear to have done it before young John was born. So he was always M-O-N-A-S-H. Also, it is relevant to say that he was born Jewish, but he was never a practicing, active attender of synagogues or anything like that. The fact that he was buried via a synagogue service is almost accidental. He obviously had his various affairs with Gentile women, and he mixed freely in all society, and was used occasionally by the Jewish community to advocate for them, but he certainly was not a regular attender of Jewish religious services. Yeah.
Did he have anything to do with officer training prior to the First World War?
Not really. The officer training for the army had moved already to Duntroon, which is really right on the edge of Canberra. I don't think he would have ever been there until the 20s. It was a very little isolated thing up there, and to be right through the 1900s through to 1913, from what I could see, he was 90% preoccupied by running his business here in Melbourne, and 10% committed to being a reserve soldier fellow. After the war, he would have been somebody who would have regularly supported things like officer training, but because that was a Commonwealth responsibility, he would not have Billy Hughes wouldn't have tolerated him at all. He was persona non grata to Billy Hughes.
When was he knighted?
Good question. He was knighted by King George on the battlefield in 1918. An interesting little point worth reflecting on, and Monash made this connection. Clever guy. His part of the AIF came to the battlefields via Salisbury Plain in England, and there was a big parade down there, and King George V was there. Monash worked out. George V, born in 1865, of German parents. So they befriended each other from that point. And they both had a lot of trouble through World War I, because there was a nasty undercurrent that there were these Germans who were a fifth column on the British side. And George V copped it, along with Monash, quite nasty stuff. So they knew each other, because he was a guy from German stock who was on the Allied side, along with the King. And so apparently George essentially did it himself. He saw the Battle of Amiens as a huge triumph. It reversed the tidal wave of German advances. And so he grabbed the chance to give a knighthood to John Monash, and also to the Canadian, who was an equivalent. These guys were both reservists, by the way. Monash, an engineer from Australia, Arthur Curry, a real estate agent from Vancouver, or Vancouver Island. But those were the two who reversed it from being a progressive retreat in front of the Germans to the reverse. So they both got battlefield knighthoods.
Alan, did the Melbourne University Regiment, was that a sort of follow on to what Monash was involved in when he was at Monash?
That's my understanding, is that, before Federation it was called, it was something of the Victoria Rifles, and then once, I assume it carried on, because Monash's reserve commitment was through the North Melbourne. Once Federation had happened, he was involved in what was called the North Melbourne Rifles, I think. But then, certainly once he became Vice-Chancellor, I'll guarantee he would have reinvigorated the Melbourne University Regiment. And somewhere in there, it was reincarnated as a regiment rather than whatever it had been of the Victoria Rifles. I've talked for too long, so I apologise for that.
Something that you're interested in, Alan?
Yeah.
Captured our interest.
Have you faced anti-Semitism at all? And if so, how have you handled it?
He faced a heap of it, shoulder loads of it. That was both before Federation, when Victoria was just a colony, and afterwards, and then especially through World War One. And his approach was basically to have himself and his family well integrated into the community. And I think it might be a tactic the Jewish community now needs to, because it's under a lot of attack again. But the John Monash approach was very much about being part of Victoria, part of Australia, rather than being somebody stand out and separate. That seemed to be the way he mostly coped. Yeah. After that.
Is Iona still there?
Yeah.
Is Iona?
I understand no. No, I gather it's been bowled over and a new McMansion's been built there. That's certainly, I think it might be the Keyser book that says it's been demolished. Interesting that there wasn't much interest in his life or the things around him until the 1980s. And at that stage, another historian, a guy called Geoffrey Searle, wrote a really good, thick book that I would also recommend you read if you can find a copy somewhere. At that stage, people began to think, oh, we ought to preserve a bit more about John Monash, because even though his name was on things, his history had not been preserved until then. So my understanding is that I only got bowled over maybe in the 70s. Yeah. No? Okay, no.
So, as an ex-Monash student, I'm just wondering why they call Monash University Monash.
Well, I mean, at the time, I guess if you thought back to the late 1950s, there was a clearly already New South Wales had a second university, UNSW, and Victoria was going to have one. And I assume that the government of the day, which would have been probably the Balti government, they needed a name for a second university that would be popular. And what I can say is that back then, and that's in the era when my grandparents were in their 60s and 70s, that would have been enormously popular to have their general as the name of the new university. Because essentially that decision would have been taken very early on in the life of that campus down at Clayton. And that roughly, I know if you take my mum's family, those grandparents were in their 60s at that stage, and that would have been number one. Who would you have? They wouldn't have had tolerated being a local politician, but I would have John Monash. Yeah.
Well, the secretary just reminded me that apparently Sir John Monash was a patent lawyer.
Yeah,
Are you familiar with that?
Yes, he
non-patent.
Yeah.
He did some court cases.
Did he?
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, he through the he graduated as an engineer, but then he progressively acquired a couple of other degrees, and he certainly acquired court skills, and he was canny about ways of wealth creation, and he realised that patents were one option, and especially around the Monia system for reinforcing steel was something he brought in from elsewhere, paid money for it, but he would have been keen to protect the rights of his companies. He was clever, got on his feet in court, so yes, it'd be fair to say, the other thing to understand about his life, there was really no, a typical week, he worked the whole week. Monday through to Saturday morning would have been at work wherever. Then he might have taken a little bit of time off Saturday afternoon. Sunday morning, it's recorded in these books, was when he did his personal accounts. That's the home finances for Iona and so on. And then Sunday afternoon was when he allocated that to the grandchildren. He was a home hobbyist. He'd help them to make little houses and so on in his workshop at Iona. So he was never still, and in some of that time, I'll guarantee he would have worked out about becoming having some skills in patents and so on. He was a very driven fellow. Yeah. I think we're about the end of it.
I think so.
Good. Oh, thank you very much.
Please accept this on behalf of the club for coming along today. You've been before in this presentation today. You put a lot into it. Excellent presentation and excellent to all of us here. It's terrific. I didn't know a lot about John Monash. I've travelled overseas in the last few years and taken up a little bit about him in recent times, read about his victories in July, August 1918. But it's lamentable when I think about it. I finished school in 1971 and one of the last subjects that I did at school was Australian history. Yeah. I don't remember learning anything about Sir John Monash. Yeah. But what a clever man. And